Okay, good morning. In April of 2013, the heads of Facebook, Virgin Airlines, and Apple all announced that they would cover the cost of egg freezing for their female employees interested in fertility preservation without any medical reasons. And a heated public debate quickly ensued. We are incredibly lucky to have a pioneer in the field of fertility preservation for a conversation on this. I'm Yoetzet Halacha Adina Blaustein.
Hi, I'm BatSheva Maslow. I'm a reproductive endocrinologist. I work at Extend Fertility, which is the first practice in the United States that was really geared towards helping women think about their fertility in a proactive fashion and creating a space for women to proceed with egg freezing in a way that is inviting, applicable, acceptable, attainable. And I spend a lot of my day talking to women about their fertility and being proactive about it. And I'm really excited to share that with you today.
You can take a look at our bios down this box where you see us speaking, and you can scroll down to learn more about us. Now, the controversy following Apple and Facebook's announcement really underscores how this scientific advancement has opened up new options and really necessitated a new conversation as we consider the medical, societal, emotional, and of course, halachic implications of this procedure. Will the availability of this procedure put more or less stress on single women and men for that matter as they consider how this procedure might impact navigating pursuing relationships? Dr. Maslow, obviously you're a reproductive endocrinologist and infertility specialist, and you help women think proactively about their fertility. When you were in medical school, did you think that this would be your career path? When and why did this procedure gain so much attention?
So certainly not. When I was in medical school, this was not something that was really being spoken about. This is really the way we speak about egg freezing in terms of something that a young woman could consider just deciding to do has really only been around for the last 6-7 years or so. It's been available for a little bit longer, but it's only joined our conversations and our society very recently. So when I was in medical school, this was not something I was thinking about regularly. But the idea of fertility preservation was born out of the field of oncofertility, which is preserving fertility in the face of a medical condition like cancer and chemotherapy treatment that might significantly harm fertility as a result of the treatment. And what we've learned as an extension of that is that we've come to recognize how much age has an impact on fertility in a natural sense, and how much that can hamper our abilities to achieve our reproductive goals. And as the procedure became more technologically advanced and safe and efficacious, it became more acceptable and available to lots of people. And as more people have done it, people talk about it, it becomes less stigmatized and more available, both emotionally and financially. And so here we are. It's something that's a big part of the conversations I have on a day-to-day basis, a big part of the thought processes that young women are having around the world. And it's really permeating our lives in all sorts of ways we never would have expected.
Wow, thank you, Dr. Maslow. So what does this process actually entail? Can you walk us through the procedure?
Sure. So egg freezing itself, the actual process itself, only takes about 2 weeks. We typically start with the beginning of someone's menstrual cycle, and every place is going to do it somewhat differently, but the basics are kind of the same. Typically in my practice, I'll have my patients call us with the first day of their period, and we have them come in for blood work and ultrasound on the second or third day to make sure that everything looks good and ready to get started. We have our patients take hormonal injections for about 8 to 12 days. These are the same hormones that our brain is using to regulate our menstrual cycle. But naturally, the brain just sends a little message to the ovary to select one egg to grow. And here we are trying to send a much stronger message for a longer period of time in order to really get the ovary to grow not just one egg, but hopefully many as it could for that period of time. It usually takes about 8 to 12 days of stimulation. During those 8 to 12 days, we do monitoring visits every 2 to 3 days to make sure that we're adjusting the medications and individualizing the protocol based on each individual woman's response. And when the eggs look like they're ready, we retrieve them from their body in a very minor procedure called an egg retrieval. It only takes about 15 minutes to do. We typically do it with a little bit of anesthesia so you don't feel it nobody's aware of what's going on. And we use a transvaginal ultrasound probe and a needle through the vaginal wall. So there's no incisions and there's no stitches. And, the patient wakes up a few minutes after we're done, hangs out in our recovery room for like 30, 40 minutes, and then is free to go home and usually is ready to kind of go back to their usual life within a day or so. Once we have the eggs, we let them mature, which is a physical characteristic that the egg needs to develop in order to fertilize one day. And then we freeze them, and then they can remain frozen essentially indefinitely. And so that's the process in a nutshell. Prior to initiating the process, we always like to have a much more deeper conversation with our patients, kind of about all the different factors that go into play, and making sure that that you walk into this conversation and to this process, really understanding what's going on and why it makes sense for you.
So it's amazing that despite years of scientific advancement and medical care and greater life expectancy, the average age of menopause still hasn't changed, but this is the great advancement. So I'd like to explore a little bit what this means for observant women. And before considering some of the key halachic questions associated with this procedure specifically, there is a larger point that I think it's important to make regarding this and reproductive medicine in general. The Meiri from 13th century Spain, author of a famous commentary on the Gemara, notes, I think somewhat prophetically, כל שהוא נעשה בפעולה טבעית אינו בכלל כשפים, אפילו ידעו לברא בריאות יפות שלא מזיג המין. Any advances achieved through natural science are not to be considered magic, which is prohibited. Even if science will know how to create human beings without the natural intimate act, that is not in the category of forbidden magic. We don't accuse doctors of playing God. If these procedures can help people, our attitude is not to ignore the halachic issues, but to deal with them. And overall, encourage the pursuit and research of new technologies and procedures and embrace and promote them when they can assist us in fulfilling what is Hashem's first command to man, which is be fruitful and multiply and fill the land. And it's in our innate human drive, but it's also a commandment. The Talmud in Yevamot explores if this applies equally to men and women, and it seems like it's left up to an unresolved debate. The Meshech Chachma, Rav Meir Simcha of Dvinsk, actually suggests in a famous commentary on Bereshit that this does not apply equally to men and women, since it cannot. Given the nature of how men and women are able to fulfill the obligation, I quote from his words translated into English, the reason the Torah exempted women from Pru and obligated only men is because God's law and the Torah's ways are ways of pleasantness, and all her ways are peace. And the Torah did not burden a Jew with an obligation that he is physically unable to handle. Therefore, regarding women who are in danger during pregnancy and childbirth, the Torah did not obligate them to procreate. However, obviously, many, while they might agree with the Meiri, and obviously a woman is not commanded to fulfill, that she must fulfill through Ravu, she obviously fulfills a voluntary mitzvah when she does so. Another halachic issue that's important to consider is the prohibition to mutilate oneself or to voluntarily cause harm to oneself or to cause pain to oneself. Now, Dr. Maslow described the procedure as incredibly painless and seems like risk-free, right? Is that how you would describe it?
Well, nothing is risk-free, I would say. There's always going to be some risks, and there certainly can be some discomforts associated with this, but it's generally a very low-risk procedure. When we quote complication rates, we're talking about complications that are less than 1 in 1,000. Most women who are going to experience it will experience some discomfort that's on the order of, premenstrual type symptoms, maybe slightly worse, all of which are going to resolve typically within a few days to a week after the whole process is over. So a relatively small blip in your discomfort level, but unfortunately nothing is totally risk-free.
So then it is important to consider halachically, is one able to put themselves through that, albeit minor risk or minor pain, but is one allowed to do that? And with regard to this question, many cite Rav Moshe Feinstein's famous responsa. I believe this was originally written regarding rhinoplasty. And he notes that even though, and I'm quoting also again, translated into English, it is appropriate to allow a woman to beautify herself through means of harm, since it is not to mutilate herself, rather just the opposite for her benefit. And even though this situation, with the situation of cosmetic surgery, it's not technically refuah, it is not technically healing oneself since there is no sickness or illness, Rav Moshe is acknowledging that the harm or the risk or the limited damage that is self-inflicted is ultimately desired and for her betterment. And in some cases, not just a physical, but there's going to be a psychological benefit as well. And certainly a single woman, and for that matter, a woman who's undergoing a medical treatment and wants to preserve her fertility, obviously the woman who's pursuing this is willing to accept a small degree of risk or pain with the most optimistic hopes of a beautiful outcome down the line. Dr. Maslow, you've already shared with us an overview of the actual procedure itself, but can you speak a little bit more about this kind of investment, emotional and financial, that's necessary in order for this procedure to be successful?
Sure. So as with any investment, you have to think about the upfront costs, and I'm going to use the term costs sort of liberally here. We're going to talk about costs in terms of, yes, the financial investment, but the emotional investment that goes into it, the physical investment that goes into it, and then you have to look at the payoff. And part of this and part of the conversations that we have with women is this balance of, am I going to do this process? What's my likelihood of actually needing these eggs? What's my likelihood that if I do need these eggs, that they're going to be successful? And that's really where the individualized conversation comes through, because it's not going to be the same for everyone. Now, we know that female fertility declines with age. That's a constant, and that's true for all of us. But it declines in different ways for different people. And it's this balance between understanding that the quality of our eggs, meaning the likelihood that any one egg could go on to produce a healthy baby, will decline as we get older. And that's pretty consistent along age groups. But the other thing that declines is the number of eggs, the quantity of eggs. We all have more eggs when we're younger than when we're older, and we all have more eggs now than we will have a few years from now. But we all start at different places and we lose our eggs at different speeds. And so at any given age, the number of eggs that somebody's going to be able to retrieve and freeze is going to vary widely from one woman to the next. And so it's really important to get individualized conversation where, okay, I can say to my patients, this is how many eggs I roughly think we're going to get. This is based on your age, what I think your chances might be to get pregnant with these eggs should you need them in the future. And the goal is ultimately to have enough stored away. And the truth is, no matter how many you store away, there's never a guarantee. But enough stored away so that if someone were to ever find themselves needing infertility treatments in the future, and like we said, infertility increases as we get older, the chances of success are going to be directly related to the age of the eggs that are being used. So if somebody's 40, but she gets to use her 30-year-old eggs, then her chances of success are that of a 30-year-old. And that's the underlying reason for doing all of this. The investment comes with understanding that there's going to be a good portion of women who may never need these eggs. They may never experience infertility. They may complete their families before they actually get to an age in which they do experience trouble getting pregnant. But certainly amongst the Orthodox community and observant women, we live in a society where we want to have large families. Generally, it's more than just one or two children. That's the goal. And in order to achieve that goal, it takes time. And if you're somebody who hasn't found your partner early on, that time is limited in terms of how many children, how many successful pregnancies can you fit into a period of time before the natural course of infertility takes place. And so it's not uncommon when I talk to observant women that we're thinking, wait, maybe these eggs might be used for a third baby or a fourth baby or even a fifth baby. And so the chances that the eggs might be used kind of goes up in the observant community. But we really do have to grapple with the costs that go into it. And so what I think about when I talk to patients is one, kind of the vulnerability factor, meaning to come in and sit. Nobody wants to come see me. Nobody wants to come talk about freezing their eggs. Nobody lived their life saying, when I get to age 30, I'm going to freeze my eggs. That's my first plan. it's always a plan B. It's always a grappling with the vulnerability that this is not where I expected my life to go. And being able to kind of wrap my arms around that and say, okay, that's true. And I'm still going to be able to do something about it. And that's hard. That's a really hard place to be. And a hard conversation to have. And it's not comfortable. So that's number one in terms of the investment. Number two, it's a significant financial investment. Those who are fortunate enough to work for corporations that have financial support for egg freezing, it's a much easier conversation. We're talking about thousands of dollars generally, at Extend, which is just one of the many places people can get their can go for this procedure, although we do probably more than anyone in the country. An egg freezing cycle costs $6,500, plus the cost of medications, plus the cost of storage. So it's a significant investment, and one that you have to think about in terms of, well, what happens if I need infertility treatment later on? Because that's also going to be a significant cost. And so there's a balance here, and that the scale will not be the same for every person. Some women are going to get a tremendous amount of eggs in one cycle, and some are going to need multiple cycles to get to a level where they feel comfortable, and some are only going to be able to afford one cycle. And so that goes deeply into the conversation about whether this is something you should pursue, and when, and how many times. And it's very, very individualized.
So it sounds like, Dr. Maslow, you establish these relationships with your patients, and these relationships can continue over a period of time. So as you get to know your patients, how have you seen that this has impacted them once they are ready to pursue pregnancy, either have found the right life partner, or it's the right stage in their life when they're ready to use their eggs?
I've seen it in a variety of ways. And it's interesting because, like we said, it's still a relatively new phenomenon. Most women who are freezing their eggs are planning to freeze their eggs for a long period of time. So the women who I'm starting to see come back to use their frozen eggs are women who froze their eggs 5 or 6 years ago. But I see immediate impact on people's lives even right after the procedure. I'd say there's kind of two camps. There certainly are the women who feel very empowered once they've completed the procedure, and it affects the way they go about their dating. It impacts their relationships, knowing that they've done something for themselves, something to really increase the chances that they'll reach their reproductive goals, gives them a little bit more assurance and a little bit more comfort in the process. Not everyone, though, and I always caution my patients to say, the disappointment of still not having your partner is going to exist when this is over. And the day-to-day of still having to date and still be looking for someone doesn't go away after you freeze your eggs. So I caution people into putting too much hope that it will change their life outcome, but it does for some women, for sure. I've had women email me back after they've gotten married and explain how much more they've learned from the process, learned about their own bodies, learned about what to expect from fertility, and feel more knowledgeable going into the trying to conceive phase of their lives just from having done this process. And then I have those who have come back, who have attempted to conceive, who are struggling and don't have to fall into this kind of despair of what do we do now? We've been trying to conceive and we haven't been successful. And then just starting to build that process where they're like, I know exactly what to do. I know exactly where to go. And sometimes the answer isn't going straight to frozen eggs, but they have already established that relationship. They have a basic knowledge of what the process might look like. And thank God I've had success in a variety of ways of bringing about families, both without the frozen eggs and with frozen eggs. And it really does extend the ability to conceive into the later years. Sometimes these are women who are on their second marriages. Sometimes these are relationships that took a long time to develop. And it's just a really beautiful thing to be able to see families growing, knowing that 10 years ago, this may not have been able to happen.
Wow. I should note that Rabbi Weitzman of Mechon Pua, a leading halachic expert in reproductive medicine, has spoken publicly and voiced his support and encouragement for egg freezing, not just for women who are seeking to preserve their fertility as they undergo medical treatments, but for single women who hope to build a family once they meet their right life partner. But I think I must emphasize that there is no obligation to do so. And for women in this position who do feel that this is the appropriate move, it's a courageous and a bold step. And I don't view it as having less faith or amunah that you're going to find the right person, but perhaps even more faith, more amunah. And this certainly calls to mind the sobering question that the Gemara speaks about in Masechet Shabbat regarding the questions that you are asked before you pass on to the next world. Person is brought to judgment for the life he lived in this world, and they say to him in the order of that verse, did you conduct business faithfully? Did you designate times for Torah study? Did you engage in procreation? And the Maharsha comments on this that the Gemara doesn't say, did you procreate? The Gemara says, did you engage in procreation? Acknowledging in this very boldly creative statement, the Maharsha is specifying it even includes, did you marry off others? Did you try and find partners for orphans who don't have parents to arrange their marriages? You know, some of us are parents. Some of us might even work in fields like Dr. Maslow, where you have this incredible merit to be able to say that I actively helped others in bringing children into the world and building families. I helped those who yearn to be parents achieve that dream. But that doesn't mean that there is only one way to fulfill this obligation of asakta b'perei v'revia. Did you engage in procreation? When we reflect on the purpose of our life and what will bring fulfillment to our lives, the Maharsha reminds us of how humble and insignificant our actions can be sometimes. You know, we can yearn and yearn for something and aren't necessarily guaranteed a result, but it's the effort that we put into achieving this dream of building our family to continue our Jewish legacy, both for ourselves and for others. That should be our life's work and mission. And I just have to note, Dr. Maslow, you noted the cost of egg freezing, and it's certainly high, but it's free to pick up the phone and network on someone's behalf to help set them up. And I think we all have to consider we all have our roles to play in helping, you know, the Jewish community continue to thrive. At this point, I'd like to invite you, I'm sure many of you might have questions for Dr. Maslow about this procedure. I'd like to invite you to post your questions in the chat, and our host can direct the questions to either Dr. Maslow or myself. And we would love to hear what's on your mind. Are there any questions?
Here, how about I'll start with some very typical questions that I get while people ask questions. I think the number one question that I typically get is, what is the right age to do this? And hopefully I've already impressed upon everyone that there really isn't a single best answer for many of these questions, because everybody's going to be different. Everybody's goals are different. Everybody's limitations in terms of their finances, their physical limitations, their time limitations, and their potential in terms of their fertility are going to be different. So there really isn't a perfect time. Generally, what I tell people is, barring any kind of known family history or medical history, somewhere between 30 and 34 is often the best time to at least start looking into this. In some ways, the younger you do this, the better, meaning the better eggs you're going to get, and the more eggs you're going to get, and the more likely it is that if you ever need those eggs, they will work for you. But it's also the more likely that you'll never need those eggs because you have a longer time to actually fulfill your reproductive goals. And so typically, I certainly see women who come to me in their late 20s. Many of them will kind of get the information and then say, okay, let me wait another year or two. And I see now that it's become less stigmatized. People are coming younger and younger and doing it at a younger age, meaning it used to be thought of as, if you did it, it was like a very desperate move. And so it was most of the women that I saw were somewhat older, and now that age has really come down, and it's not viewed that way anymore. It's really viewed as something proactive.
So what do you think has allowed that shift to happen?
I think it's just permeated culturally. It's permeated the conversations. When I first started at Extend, which is now I'm in my almost fifth year here, or fourth or fifth year here. When I first started, everyone I spoke to, not even just the not even Orthodox Jewish women, but like everyone that I spoke to was like, nobody knows I'm doing this. I haven't told anybody. I'm just doing this for myself. I'm not telling anybody. I never hear that anymore. Everybody's telling me, oh, I have this many friends who have done it. We're all doing it together. I've had groups of Orthodox women who will all do it together. They all like sit at the Shabbos table and give each other injections. There's a much greater sense of camaraderie, a much greater sense of purpose, much less of a shame around it. And I think that's encouraged other people to continue to pursue it and at a younger age.
A question that I had as I was researching this topic and preparing with you was for women who are in the position that they don't work for a corporation that's going to sponsor it, or for women who are perfectly healthy and aren't doing this because there's a medical treatment that they need to, that would necessitate this. Are there any financial assistance programs to help them? And I guess I'll first pose the question to you: what kind does your organization have financing plans that assist women? I'll just say from the outset, before you respond to that, Bonei Olam is a charity that I found that is willing to help single women pursue this.
So I'll say this, there's certainly in our practice, and I know I can't speak for others, but in our practice, we have, there's like financing options that are helpful. There are within the Jewish community organizations that are helpful. In Bonei Olam in the past has been much more focused on infertility rather than fertility preservation. And I don't know exactly where they stand in terms of individual cases, but they do review things from like a case-by-case basis. And there are other organizations as well, like Time and PUA, that are also have been in the past really mostly focused on infertility. They've branched out even more so than Bonei Olam in terms of offering certainly emotional support and assistance. A Time as a whole network of people who will help with injections, and so there's a lot of emotional assistance as well. And they often have opportunities for financial support on occasion. The Hebrew Free Loan Society, or some of those free loan, sometimes have options for free loan, like interest-free loans. And those are the ones that come to mind in terms of financial support, but they're growing. There's more and more opportunities every day to get some of those, to be able to have some communal support for it.
Mm-hmm. A question that was just posted in the chat from our listeners was, can you speak about the percentages that have been successful? And I guess we have to define success, because at different stages, it might mean something different.
Sure. So the chances of success, and I'll define success in its most limited term, which is a live-born baby, right? That's really what our ultimate goal here is, to have a baby. So let's define it in its most limited term in that way. So the chances of having a baby are going to be directly related to the age of the eggs, that at the age of the woman at the time she froze her eggs, and the number of eggs that she froze. To put things in perspective, let's say 10 eggs, which is even a little bit below average number of eggs frozen for somebody who is 30 to 34. 10 eggs is about a 65-70% chance of at least one baby. That means that if you had 100 women, or you had 10 women who were under 34 who froze 10 eggs, 6 to 7 of them would have a live-born baby from those 10 eggs. And truthfully, the average number of eggs frozen under 34 is a little higher than that. So most women are going to reach at least that in one cycle. 35 to 38, 10 eggs is about a 55 to 60% chance. So it goes down a little bit. And that's because the quality starts to decline. After 38, 10 eggs is going to be more like a 45 to 50% chance of at least one baby. And you start to see that the quality really declines significantly. The other thing that starts to happen as women get older is much less likely that you're going to get 10 eggs in one cycle. So the average number of eggs frozen for someone who's 38 to 40, let's say, is really more like 7 to 8. And so most women are going to need additional cycles to even get to that 50-60% chance.
And that would make this even more expensive.
Correct. A little longer, a little more expensive. I published a medical journal article last year looking at this question a little bit, but the kind of take-home message from that research study was that most women, regardless of age, are going to be able to get to that somewhere between a 50 to 70% chance of at least one baby in 1 to 2 cycles. And the younger you are, the more likely it happens in one cycle, or that you get to that higher level. But to get to like 80-90% chance of at least one baby and like a 50 or so % chance of 2 babies, most people are going to need 20 or more eggs, and very few people can really freeze 20 or more eggs in one cycle. So that's where there's all this nuance that has to happen and discuss. And, not every egg freezing cycle is created equally. And it's certainly not the panacea that we would love it to be. But like you said, it's kind of the most radical advancement we've made in the past decade or two in terms of kind of, I wouldn't say preventing infertility, but it sort of circumvents infertility in some ways.
On that topic of infertility and egg freezing, a question posed by our audience member is, if a woman is struggling to conceive, can she undergo egg freezing as well as other fertility treatments?
Absolutely. And I think what's going to be interesting is that as egg freezing becomes more normalized and how more and more people are talking about it, the implications for other populations, not just single women, are going to become apparent. One of the things I talk to people about, I also see plenty of infertility couples who are experiencing infertility. One of the things that comes up, and one of the conversation pieces, is how much our plans about having a family play into so many of our decisions, right? Buying a house, taking a new job, buying a new car, where to send, the kids you have to school, what community to live in. So many of those decisions are founded upon, what are our reproductive goals? How many kids do we want to have? When do we think we're going to have more children? And when you throw a monkey wrench into that, where you think you're going to have a certain number of children and then it becomes more difficult, or you're trying for your first child and it's taking much longer than expected, all of those things kind of get unsettled. And the idea of fertility preservation is to kind of put a mattress under that fall. And I've already had married couples who have come to me and said, should we preserve eggs or embryos in case we run into a problem later on, because younger eggs or embryos are going to be more successful than older eggs. Now, that's not a common thing that people are thinking about now, but I suspect in the future that might be a more common conversation that we have. And so if somebody's experiencing infertility, there is room to start talking about not only doing something for the present, but what about for the future? And sometimes that looks like, well, we could do a less aggressive infertility treatment like IUI. That will help us get a chance of a pregnancy right now. Or maybe we think about doing a more aggressive fertility treatment like IVF, and that allows us to have a pregnancy now, but also potentially preserve eggs or embryos for the future. Even though it may not necessarily be indicated by the circumstances right now, it allows us to kind of have a little bit of a forward look. Now, most people aren't thinking that way, but it is something that especially in the firm community where we're talking about having large families, it does come up, and it's part of the conversation, and one that I think, because I live in that community and because I think that way too, I can have with a patient and it doesn't feel awkward.
A question that I think takes us in a bit of a different direction. Can we talk about mature versus immature eggs, and can you clarify a little bit of those terms?
Sure. So let me take half a step back and just describe what an egg is on a cellular level. So an egg, actually the scientific term for an egg is an oocyte. An oocyte is actually the largest single cell in the human body. And an oocyte, similar to a sperm, should contain half the normal number of chromosomes, right? So a typical human cell should have 46 chromosomes. When we get 23 chromosomes from mom in her egg and 23 chromosomes from dad. And so the egg and sperm cells need to undergo meiosis. You can go remember back to like 9th and 10th grade biology about meiosis and mitosis. So eggs have to undergo meiosis in order to go from 46 chromosomes to 23 chromosomes. And so when we talk about eggs being mature, that's actually just a term we use to indicate that the egg is undergoing meiosis. If an egg hasn't undergone meiosis, it's not going to be able to be fertilized because it's not going to have the right number of chromosomes. It happens to be because the egg is large and because we know a lot about egg structures and the way they develop, we can identify when the egg is undergoing meiosis by looking at it under the microscope. And so you can freeze immature eggs. The problem is that once you thaw them, the chances that they will actually be able to fertilize and become a baby are very, very small. And in general, if you've allowed the eggs to try to mature and they haven't, they're not going to once you thaw them. And so my preference has generally been to freeze mature eggs because that allows women to be able to make competent decisions about what they have frozen, knowing that what they have frozen are the ones that are going to be usable. There is right now the technology around immature eggs, and maybe this is sort of where this question is going, is a little bit controversial because for decades, the scientific community, we've been working to try to learn how to mature eggs in the lab. So in vitro fertilization, that's what IVF stands for. In vitro means in the lab. It's where we fertilize eggs in the laboratory. In vitro maturation has been sort of this thing that we've been going after that really hasn't been achieved in a reliable, successful way. If we could figure out how to really reliably and successfully mature eggs in the lab, that would change a lot of things. It means you could take just you could surgically just kind of slough off a little piece of the ovary and freeze the ovary and then mature all the eggs in it without having to kind of do all the stimulation. So all sorts of things that could be done. It could help for like young girls undergoing chemotherapy. Right now, their options are limited to like freezing portions of the ovary and then reimplanting them for maturity, all sorts of things. But for the time being, in vitro maturation is just not a really reliable process.
Can you test these eggs for genetic anomalies?
That's a great question. So unfortunately, you can't test the eggs, and it goes back to what we were describing before. An egg is just a single cell, so there's only one set of chromosomes in there. And so if you were to take the DNA out to test it, you basically destroy the egg in the process. And really the number one cause of eggs either not working, not fertilizing, the embryos not implanting, or pregnancies ending in an early miscarriage are chromosomal abnormalities that develop either in the egg or in the sperm, but typically in the egg and typically with age. So when we talk about egg quality, one of the things that happens as women get older is that this meiosis process doesn't happen as reliably. And so some chromosomes don't divide properly, and you end up with eggs that have either too many or too few chromosomes. That's what often is really responsible for the fact that as women get older, we naturally take longer to get pregnant because each month there's just one egg available for pregnancy. And if that's a good egg, then that's a month in which someone could conceive. But if it's not a good egg, that's a month in which you won't conceive. And so naturally time to pregnancy will increase as we get older. And ultimately infertility rates will increase because we define infertility as having tried for a year without success. So the quality or the DNA and chromosomes inside the egg is actually a critical component of all of this. And we can't test it at the egg stage. However, once an egg is fertilized, the ones that make it to the final embryo stage, what we call the blastocyst, will have hundreds of cells, and you actually can sample a few cells off the surface of the embryo and test those cells to get basically a report of what the chromosome content of your embryos are. And that's called PGT, or pre-implantation genetic testing. Typically, it's done now for what we call aneuploidy, so PGT-A, which is testing to make sure that there's the right number of chromosomes, that there isn't too many or too few. It can also be used for what we call PGT-M, which is for mutation, which is what we used to call PGD. And that's looking for a particular mutation that you can look for. Those are really teeny, tiny genetic errors that you have to develop special probes to know to look for in advance. But all of that can be done only on the embryo and not on the egg. And that's why we have to think about freezing enough eggs to compensate for the fact that a portion of them, and truthfully, often it's the majority of them, are not going to work. And that's where the numbers become such a huge part of this conversation.
An important halachic question to consider that someone posted is there a halachic issue with not using or destroying the unused frozen eggs? And just based on some research that I've done, Rav Willig is comfortable with that.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, I've done a lot of research in this and had a lot of conversations and shiurim that I've given on this topic. And by and large, unlike other let's say like the Catholic Church, for example, by and large, Judaism does not view, it doesn't even view embryos with the same status that we would think of as having had life where you can't destroy it, even more so eggs. So while sperm has its own sort of unique characteristic and there are certain unique conversations around what to do with sperm, eggs really don't take don't have that same kind of weight. And most, I would say by and large, even, I see a wide range of Orthodox Judaism, and really mitzad letzad, I see people are generally very comfortable discarding unused eggs and embryos.
I'm going to zoom out for a second. I think we have a time for maybe one or two more topics. One theme I've noticed in some of the questions coming in is with regard to male infertility. So one question posed is there any impact on the chances of success of egg freezing with the age of the male partner? Is there anything that older single men should consider when thinking about increasing their chances for fertility in the future?
So that's a fantastic question, and one that I really applaud whoever asked these questions. It doesn't come up very often. Men and women are different, obviously, in many, many different ways. But the way eggs and sperm are generated are actually very, very different. So women are born with all the eggs we'll ever have. I often tell people it's kind of like those little sand hourglasses that you get with board games, right? Like the moment we're born, we flip that over and the sand starts pouring out. And so the eggs that we have live with us our whole lives. Actually, eggs are one of the longest living cells in the body in humanity. Sperm, on the other hand, is actually the complete opposite. Men are generating new sperm every single day. And so sperm is not as affected by age because there's fresh sperm all the time. But unlike eggs, sperm is actually extraordinarily susceptible to the environment. So women, their fertility is often really not affected by things that they do. So lifestyle changes, weight, drinking, like exercise, not exercise, stress, not stress, all those things have very little impact on female fertility. On the other hand, those kinds of things actually can have a profound impact on male fertility. So men, sperm counts are extraordinarily affected by things like weight gain, weight loss, smoking, drinking, temperatures, exposure, toxic exposures, sleep, illnesses, just like there are some good studies that show in the springtime, sperm counts tend to drop as a result of the fall flu season, right? So men get flu, a few months later, their sperm count drops because it takes about 90 days for new sperm to be produced. So if you had like a 1 week illness and you stopped producing sperm for about a week, then 3 months later, you're going to see this kind of drop. Thankfully, most of those drops are temporary. It also kind of explains men, a typical sperm count, if you look at a semen analysis, we're talking about tens of millions or sometimes hundreds of millions of sperm in a milliliter of fluid. And why are there so many? Well, part of that is to buffer this up and down, meaning one day it might be 100 million, the next day it might be 40 million. That's like a huge drop, but that's still way more than enough. And so that most of the time, those swings are not going to affect the outcome in terms of the ability to conceive. Occasionally you have, men who live at the borderline, and sometimes they drop below a threshold in which it does affect it. And so really, it's not so much that age affects male fertility as much as it is the accumulation of exposures over time. And so outside of a world where we're constantly testing men's sperm, which is certainly not something, especially in the Orthodox community, that we're going to be rushing to anytime soon, living a healthy lifestyle is actually so much more important for men who are thinking about having a family than it is even for females who are thinking about having a family. And so things like being at a healthy weight, cutting back on smoking and drinking, cutting back on smoking entirely, drinking to a moderate amount, getting good sleep, all those things, these lifestyle habits are actually critically important.
One important question to think about is infertility genetic? For example, if you are aware that your parents had a hard time conceiving, should you be concerned for conceiving yourself?
That is a great question. It's generally not, but it kind of depends on what the reason for infertility is. There are so many different causes of infertility, some of which can be genetic in some way, but most of which are not. And so I think on the one hand, I would feel reassured, if your parents your parents struggled with infertility, I don't think you need to carry that burden and assume that you too will have a problem with infertility. That being said, if there's a family history and you've been trying to conceive and it hasn't been successful, you're probably not the person I would want to say, whatever, you're fine, you're young, keep trying. You may want to just seek assistance, or at least start the process of looking into it a little earlier. If it's not, generally we recommend getting an evaluation after 12 months of conceiving if the woman is under 35, and after 6 months of conceiving if the woman is older than 35, mostly because older than 35, time is a little more precious. And so you don't want to spend that extra 6 months if you don't have to. So I would say if you have a strong family history, somewhere in that 6 to 12 months might be worth getting, at least even just with a general OBGYN, kind of a check-in to see, do the obvious things look like they're kind of all in place?
One question, which might be the question that we close with, I think, is I think a testament to you, BatSheva, Dr. Maslow. Somebody asked, is there a way to extend to make sure that they see a female doctor?
So I am the female doctor. You can certainly call and ask to see me. And certainly for our initial evaluation, that's always going to be respected, although it's just a matter of my schedule and getting in to see me. Any fertility practice, fertility treatment is a 24/7 operation, and egg freezing is no different. Although I will say, I'm going to take one sidebar that our practice are extraordinarily sensitive to Shabbos and the needs of Orthodox patients who are going through either egg freezing or infertility treatment as it relates to Shabbos. And so it's very rare that I have a situation where somebody's going to need to come in on Shabbos. Extraordinarily rare. It happens, but very uncommonly. But the practice is a 24/7 practice, meaning we have procedures that go on Shabbos because there are people who need to have their procedures done on Shabbos. We have procedures on Sundays. Like I'm not working today, so I can do this, but generally I'm working on Sundays. So while I can't promise that I'm always available, that you'll always see a female physician for your procedure. I do very much try to do my patients' procedures, but it's hard to be available literally 7 days a week. But at least for the initial consultation and for kind of who's driving the bus, it should work out.
Dr. Maslow, thank you so much for graciously donating your time and presenting. It was so interesting to listen to you speak, and it was an honor to share this platform with you. To all our audience members, thank you so much for joining, and please make sure to check out the amazing array of presentations over the next few days as part of this larger Health and Halacha conference. Thank you so much, everybody, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you so much for sharing your sources. Those were some good ones I hadn't seen in a long time.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.